Have you ever had a moment where your past walked through the door and shattered the fragile peace you'd built for yourself? Where someone who had hurt you suddenly appeared in the one place you felt safe? That terrifying collision between what was and what you desperately hoped could be is exactly what happened to me on a Tuesday evening in October, and it changed my entire world. The dinner rush at Benedetto's was in full swing when everything fell apart. I balanced 3 plates of osso buco on my left arm, while carrying a bottle of Chianti Classico in my right hand, weaving between tables with the practiced grace that came from 6 months of working here. The restaurant hummed with the low conversation of wealthy patrons, the soft clink of expensive crystal, and the occasional burst of laughter from the corner booth where a group of businessmen were celebrating some deal. My name is Celeste Romano, and at 24, this job at Benedetto's represented everything I'd fought to build after my world had collapsed. The upscale Italian restaurant in the heart of downtown was more than just employment. It was sanctuary. Here, surrounded by warm lighting, rich mahogany, and the scent of garlic and fresh basil, I felt protected from the chaos I'd left behind. I'd been running for 3 months before I found this place. 3 months of sleeping in my car, staying in cheap motels, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid. But Benedetto's had given me something I thought I'd lost forever. The possibility of a normal life. The work was demanding, the customers could be difficult, but for the first time in 2 years, I could breathe without fear. I could sleep through the night without jumping at every sound. I could almost believe that maybe, just maybe, I was finally safe. The restaurant itself reflected old-world elegance mixed with modern sophistication. Deep burgundy leather banquettes lined the walls beneath oil paintings of Italian landscapes, while the bar area showcased an impressive collection of wines behind glass panels that caught and reflected the warm overhead lighting. Most of our clientele were business executives, attorneys, and what I suspected were some less conventional but equally wealthy individuals who spoke in low tones and paid their bills in cash. I delivered the osso buco to table 12 with a smile that had become second nature. Mrs. Castellano, one of our regulars, complimented the presentation, and I felt that small glow of satisfaction that came from doing my job well. For someone who had spent months feeling worthless and incompetent, these small victories mattered more than anyone could know. That's when I saw him. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cool October air, and my entire world tilted sideways. Damian Fletcher stood in the doorway, his blonde hair styled exactly as I remembered, his pale blue eyes scanning the dining room with that predatory confidence that used to make my stomach clench with fear. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that I knew cost more than I made in 3 months, and he carried himself with the same arrogant bearing that had once convinced me he was powerful, sophisticated, someone who could take care of me. Now I knew better. Now I knew that beneath that polished exterior was someone capable of cruelty I was still trying to forget. My hands started shaking so violently that the empty wine bottle slipped from my grasp. The crash of glass hitting the marble floor seemed impossibly loud in my ears, though the rest of the restaurant barely paused in their conversations. I stood frozen among the scattered pieces, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to think beyond the terrifying realization that he had found me. How? I'd been so careful. I'd paid cash for everything, avoided social media, kept my head down. This restaurant was on the other side of the city from where I used to live, in a neighborhood I'd never frequented when I was with him. I'd thought I was invisible here, just another waitress in a city full of servers. But there he was, and he was looking directly at me. The familiar panic began to rise in my chest, that suffocating weight that made it impossible to breathe properly. My vision started to narrow, the way it always did when the fear became too much. I could feel myself shrinking, becoming smaller, the way I always had when he looked at me like that. Like I was prey. Like I belonged to him. Damian's lips curved into that smile that used to make my heart race for all the wrong reasons. He said something to the maitre d', Marcus, who nodded and gestured toward the dining room. They were walking this way. He was walking this way. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor among the broken glass, my whole body rigid with terror. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to be safe here. I was supposed to be free. Other servers had noticed my distress. Jenny, who worked the adjacent section, hurried over with a broom and dustpan, her dark eyes concerned as she started cleaning up the glass around my feet. Tommy, one of the bussers, appeared with a mop for the wine that was spreading across the marble in a dark red stain that looked too much like blood. But I barely saw them. All I could see was Damien getting closer, his pale eyes locked on mine, that horrible smile growing wider as he realized exactly how much power he still held over me. Even after 3 months of freedom, even after all the healing I thought I'd done, one look from him, and I was right back to being that terrified girl who'd spent 2 years walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set him off. Move, I told myself desperately. Run. Get to the kitchen. Lock yourself in the walk-in cooler. Call the police. Do something. But my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped in that moment, trapped by my own fear, trapped by memories of what he could do when he was angry. And he would be angry. He hated it when I tried to leave, hated it when I thought I could make decisions without his permission. The last time I'd attempted to walk away, he'd grabbed my wrist so hard it left bruises for 2 weeks. The time before that, he'd followed me to my sister's house and caused such a scene that the neighbors called the police. But I'd always gone back. I'd always believed him when he said he was sorry, when he promised things would be different. This time was supposed to be different. This time I'd finally found the courage to disappear completely. But here he was, and I was 19 years old again, helpless and afraid and convinced that I deserved whatever punishment he thought fit for my disobedience. That's when I felt a presence behind me, solid and reassuring in a way that cut through my panic. A deep voice, calm but carrying unmistakable authority, spoke just loud enough for me to hear. Wait outside. I'll take care of this. I turned, and for the first time since Damien had walked through that door, I could breathe. The man standing behind me was tall, at least 6 feet 2, with dark hair that showed hints of silver at the temples and the kind of olive complexion that spoke of Mediterranean heritage. His eyes were an unusual shade of green-gray that seemed to see everything, and he wore a perfectly tailored black suit that somehow managed to look both elegant and dangerous. I'd seen him before, always from a distance. He was Luca Benedetto, the restaurant's owner, though he rarely interacted directly with the serving staff. I'd heard whispered conversations among the other employees about him. How he'd built this place from nothing, how he commanded respect from everyone who worked here, how he had connections throughout the city that made even the most difficult customers treat him with deference. But I'd never been this close to him before, never felt the quiet intensity of his full attention. There was something about his presence that made me feel protected, even in the midst of my terror. Something that made the panic in my chest ease just enough for me to remember how to breathe. Luca's green-gray eyes moved from my face to Damien, who had stopped about 10 feet away, clearly recognizing that the dynamic in the room had shifted. The predatory confidence in Damien's expression faltered slightly as he took in the man standing protectively near me. This was it. This was where my carefully constructed new life either held together or fell completely apart. And somehow, improbably, my fate rested in the hands of a man I barely knew, whose quiet command had just promised to handle the nightmare that had walked back into my world. I didn't know what Luca Benedetto was going to do, but for the first time since I'd seen Damien's face, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have to face this alone. Luca moved past me with fluid confidence, each step deliberate and measured. I watched from behind him as he approached Damien, who had frozen midway across the dining room. The restaurant continued its elegant evening rhythm around us, but I could feel the subtle shift in energy that came from the staff recognizing their boss in action. When Luca spoke, his voice carried just enough to reach Damien without disturbing the other guests. "You're not welcome here," he said with quiet finality. "Marcus will show you out." I couldn't see Damien's face from where I stood, but I could read the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by someone he didn't know. For 2 years, I'd watched him intimidate servers, managers, even police officers with his combination of wealth and barely controlled aggression. But Luca Benedetto was clearly a different kind of man entirely. "You don't understand," Damien said, his voice carrying that edge of barely contained fury I knew too well. "I'm here for my girlfriend. She's been missing, and I have every right to take her home." The lie rolled off his tongue so easily, the same manipulation he'd used countless times before. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone in the restaurant that I wasn't missing, that I'd run from him deliberately, that going home with him meant returning to a nightmare. But my voice seemed trapped in my throat, paralyzed by 3 months of freedom that could disappear in an instant. Luca's response was so calm it was almost conversational. The young woman is my employee, and she's clearly distressed by your presence. I suggest you leave now, before this becomes unpleasant. There was something in the way he said unpleasant that made even me shiver despite being on his side. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. This wasn't a man who made empty promises. Damien took a step closer to Luca, and I felt my heart stop. I knew what happened when someone challenged him, knew how quickly his charming facade could crack to reveal the violence underneath. But Luca didn't move, didn't even seem concerned by the proximity. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Damien said, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone I'd learned to fear. Luca smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. Actually, I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation. This is my restaurant. These are my employees, and you're disturbing my guests. Leave. Now. The word now carried such finality that even the nearby tables seemed to quiet. Marcus appeared at Damien's elbow with the smooth efficiency that came from years of handling difficult situations, though I suspected this was beyond his usual experience. Damien's pale eyes found mine across the distance between us, and I saw the promise in them. This isn't over, Celeste. We both know you can't hide forever. Then he was gone, Marcus escorting him toward the front door with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask the underlying firmness. I watched until he disappeared into the night, but even then I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still waiting. The moment the door closed behind him, my legs gave out. I sank into the nearest chair, my whole body shaking so violently I could barely hold myself upright. The panic I'd been holding back crashed over me like a wave, stealing my breath and making my vision blur at the edges. This was happening again. He'd found me again. All those months of careful hiding, of building a new life, and it had taken him less than 5 minutes to destroy my sense of safety completely. A warm hand touched my shoulder, and I looked up to find Luca's green-gray eyes studying my face with concern. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere quiet." He helped me to my feet with surprising gentleness for such a large man, his hand steady at my elbow as he guided me through the restaurant toward the back offices. I was dimly aware of the other staff watching us, their faces full of curiosity and concern, but Luca's presence seemed to create a protective bubble around me. The office he led me to was clearly his, masculine and sophisticated, with darkwood furniture and the faint scent of expensive cologne. He settled me into a leather chair before moving to a small bar in the corner, returning with a glass of water and what looked like whiskey for himself. "Drink this," he said, placing the water in my trembling hands. Slowly, I obeyed, grateful for the simple instruction. The cool water helped ground me, gave me something to focus on besides the terror still racing through my system. Luca pulled another chair close to mine and sat down, his presence solid and reassuring without being overwhelming. "How long?" he asked quietly. The question was vague enough that I could have pretended not to understand, but something in his tone told me he already knew what we were really talking about. How long had Damien been hurting me? How long had I been running? How long had I been afraid? 2 years, I whispered. We were together for 2 years before I finally left. And how long have you been hiding? 3 months. I thought I was careful. I thought he couldn't find me here. Luca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What did he do to you? The gentle question broke something loose inside me, and before I could stop myself, the whole story came pouring out. How Damien had seemed so charming at first, so protective and caring. How gradually the protection had become control, the care had become manipulation. How he'd isolated me from my friends and family, convinced me that I was lucky to have someone who loved me enough to take care of me. How the first time he hit me, he'd cried afterward and sworn it would never happen again. How it had happened again anyway, and again, until I stopped counting the bruises and started planning my escape. I told him about the months of hiding money, of researching women's shelters, of waiting for the right moment when Damien would be traveling for business. How I'd finally found the courage to disappear completely, leaving behind everything I'd ever known for the chance at freedom. By the time I finished, Luca's knuckles were white where they gripped his whiskey glass. The controlled fury in his expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not the explosive rage I'd learned to fear from Damien, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "He'll never touch you again," Lucas said with quiet certainty. "I give you my word." Something in the way he said it made me believe him completely, though I couldn't understand why. I barely knew this man, had spoken to him maybe twice before tonight. But sitting there in his office, watching the protective steel in his green-gray eyes, I felt safer than I had since the day I'd walked out of my old life. "You can't go back to your apartment," he continued. "If he found you here, he knows where you live." I nodded miserably. The small studio I'd been renting was the only home I'd known in months, but he was right. Nowhere was safe anymore. "You'll stay with me," Lucas said, and it wasn't really a question. "I have a penthouse uptown. Security, privacy, everything you need while we figure out a permanent solution." I should have been terrified by the suggestion. Moving in with a stranger, depending on someone I barely knew, trusting a man whose kindness could evaporate as quickly as it had appeared. But as I looked into Luca's eyes, I felt only relief. "Thank you," I whispered. An hour later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of Luca's black Mercedes, watching the city lights blur past the windows as we drove through neighborhoods I'd never seen before. The car was immaculate and expensive, with leather seats that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. I'd grabbed a few essentials from my apartment while Luca waited in the hallway, his presence a silent guarantee that no one would hurt me. The building manager, who usually treated tenants like inconveniences, had been almost deferential when Luca introduced himself and asked for assistance. Now, as we pulled up to a gleaming high-rise in the most expensive part of downtown, I began to understand exactly how far out of my depth I was. The doorman greeted Luca by name and waved us through to private elevators that required a key card to access. The penthouse, when the doors opened directly into it, was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while the interior was a study in sophisticated masculine luxury. Everything was perfectly arranged, from the modern furniture to the artwork that probably cost more than most people made in a year. "This is your home now," Lucas said, setting my single bag down in the marble foyer. "For as long as you need it." As I stood there taking in the impossible beauty of my new surroundings, one thought echoed through my mind. I was safe. For the first time in months, possibly years, I was completely safe. But I was also beginning to realize that Luca Benedetto was far more than just a successful restaurant owner. And somehow, that realization didn't frighten me nearly as much as it should have. I woke to the scent of coffee and something that smelled like heaven: garlic, herbs, and what might have been pancetta sizzling in a pan. For a moment, I lay still in the enormous bed, disoriented by the Egyptian cotton sheets and the view of the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Then reality crashed back. Damien. The restaurant. Luca. The guest room he'd given me was larger than my entire previous apartment, decorated in soft grays and cream with touches of deep blue that somehow made the space feel both luxurious and welcoming. I'd slept better than I had in months, which should have been impossible given everything that had happened. I found a robe hanging in the massive walk-in closet, silk, in a shade of midnight blue that probably cost more than I made in a week, and wrapped myself in it before venturing out to find the source of those incredible smells. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that belonged in a high-end restaurant. Lucas stood with his back to me at the massive stove, dressed in dark jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. His dark hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd run his fingers through it, and there was something almost domestic about the way he moved around the space with practiced ease. "Good morning," he said without turning around, somehow sensing my presence. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," I admitted, settling onto one of the bar stools at the island. "Thank you. For everything." He glanced over his shoulder at me, and I felt my breath catch slightly. In the morning light streaming through the windows, his green-gray eyes seemed even more striking, and there was something about seeing him in casual clothes that made him seem more approachable, more real. "You don't need to thank me," he said, turning back to the stove. "Are you hungry?" I made frittata with pancetta and fresh herbs. The fact that he was cooking for me, that he'd thought about what I might want for breakfast, touched something deep in my chest. When was the last time someone had taken care of me like this? Damien had always expected me to handle the cooking, cleaning, everything domestic, while he focused on what he considered more important matters. "I'd love some," I said, watching as he plated the frittata with the same attention to detail I'd seen in his restaurant. Everything about his movements spoke of confidence and competence, from the way he handled the pan to how he arranged fresh fruit alongside the eggs. As he set the plate in front of me, our fingers brushed briefly. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that suggested he'd felt it too. "This is incredible," I said after the first bite, and it truly was. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the pancetta adding just the right amount of saltiness, the herbs bright and fresh. "My mother's recipe," Lucas said, settling onto the stool beside me with his own plate. "She insisted all her sons learn to cook properly. Said we'd never keep a woman happy if we expected her to take care of us like children." "How many sons?" I asked, grateful for the neutral topic even as I found myself watching the way his hands moved as he ate. He had beautiful hands, I realized, strong and capable, with long fingers that somehow managed to be both masculine and elegant. "3. I'm the oldest. Marco handles the family's construction business, and Antonio just finished law school." "Family business," he'd said, "not businesses. Plural." I filed that detail away along with all the other small hints that Luca Benedetto was more than he appeared. The tour he gave me after breakfast only reinforced that impression. The penthouse was enormous, taking up the entire top floor of the building. There was a formal dining room with a table that could seat 12, a living room with furniture that belonged in a design magazine, a library lined with books in both English and Italian, and what he casually referred to as his office. That room was different from the rest of the apartment. While the other spaces felt warm and inviting, the office was purely functional. Multiple computer monitors, filing cabinets that looked like they belonged in a bank, and a safe built into the wall that was partially hidden behind a painting. "I work from home frequently," Luca explained when he noticed me staring at the setup. "The restaurant business requires a lot of coordination." Something in his tone suggested that coordination involved more than scheduling deliveries and managing staff, but I didn't press. I was a guest in his home, dependent on his protection, in no position to ask uncomfortable questions about his business dealings. Instead, I found myself studying him as we moved through the apartment. He was tall enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, and there was something about his presence that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. When he reached up to adjust a painting that had been knocked slightly crooked, I couldn't help noticing the way his shirt pulled across broad shoulders, the hint of muscle beneath the expensive fabric. This was dangerous territory. I was attracted to him, drawn to the combination of strength and gentleness that seemed to define him. But I was also dependent on him, traumatized, in no position to trust my own judgment about men. The last time I'd been attracted to someone, it had nearly destroyed my life. Yet when Luca looked at me, I didn't feel the familiar flutter of anxiety that had become my constant companion around Damien. Instead, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed, the warm pull of genuine attraction, untainted by fear. We were in the living room when his phone rang, the sound sharp in the comfortable silence between us. He glanced at the display and frowned slightly. "Excuse me," he said. "I need to take this." He moved toward the windows as he answered, but I couldn't help overhearing fragments of the conversation. Something about a delivery that had been delayed, a shipment that needed to be rerouted, and what sounded like instructions to increase security at several locations. When he hung up, there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just business," he replied, but something in his tone suggested it was the kind of business that required the type of security measures I'd glimpsed in his office. That evening, we shared dinner at the small table in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room. Luca had insisted on cooking again, pasta with a sauce that involved ingredients I'd never heard of but tasted like something from the most expensive Italian restaurant in the city. We talked carefully around the edges of our lives, sharing safe details while avoiding the deeper truths that hovered between us. I learned that he'd taken over the restaurant from his father, who'd passed away 5 years earlier. That he missed the old country but had been born here, caught between two worlds in a way I thought I understood. That he read voraciously, collected wine, and had strong opinions about the proper way to prepare risotto. In return, I told him about my dreams of going back to school, how I'd been studying to be a teacher before my relationship with Damien had derailed everything, how I missed my sister but couldn't risk contacting her while Damien might be monitoring her communications, how working at the restaurant had been the first time in years I'd felt competent, valued, like I had something to contribute. "You're remarkable," Lucas said quietly, his green-gray eyes holding mine across the table. "To survive what you survived, to build a new life from nothing, that takes incredible strength." "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "Most of the time I feel terrified and broken and like I'm just pretending to be normal." "Strength isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's moving forward despite it. And you've been moving forward every day since you left him." There was something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, that made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. This was attraction, pure and simple, the kind of awareness that made me hyper-conscious of every movement, every breath, every moment when our eyes met across the small space between us. He felt it too. I could see it in the way his gaze dropped to my lips before returning to my eyes, in the slight tension in his posture, in the careful way he maintained distance even as everything about his body language suggested he wanted to be closer. The moment stretched between us, loaded with possibilities and questions, and the growing certainty that whatever was happening here was beyond my limited experience. I'd thought I understood attraction, thought what I'd felt for Damien had been love, but this was entirely different. This was the pull of genuine chemistry combined with respect, protection, and something deeper I didn't have a name for. His phone buzzed against the table, shattering the moment. Luca closed his eyes briefly, as if fighting some internal battle, before reaching for it. The conversation that followed was different from the earlier one. Shorter, more urgent, conducted in rapid Italian that I couldn't follow. But I could read the change in his expression, the way his entire demeanor shifted into something harder, more dangerous. When he hung up, he looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Damien has been asking questions. About you, about where you might be staying, about who might be helping you." My blood turned to ice. "You mean he's looking for me?" "He's hired someone to look for you," Luca corrected grimly. "A private investigator. But more concerning, he's also been making inquiries about me, about the restaurant, about what kind of man would interfere with his business." The implication hung between us like a threat. Damien wasn't just looking for me. He was targeting the man who'd helped me. "I should leave," I said, panic rising in my chest. "I should disappear again before he hurts you." Luca reached across the table and covered my hand with his, the contact warm and steadying. "You're not going anywhere, Celeste. You're safe here, and you'll stay safe as long as you're with me. But what if he tries to hurt you because of me? What if?" "He won't," Lucas said with quiet certainty. "I give you my word." There was something in his tone, something that spoke of resources and capabilities I could only guess at. This wasn't just a restaurant owner promising protection. This was a man who understood exactly what kind of threat Damien represented and wasn't concerned by it. As I looked into his green-gray eyes, I realized I was falling for a man I barely knew, under circumstances I couldn't control, while being protected by someone whose world I didn't understand. It should have terrified me. Instead, for the first time in 3 months, I felt truly safe. 3 days settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to normal. I spent my mornings reading in Luca's extensive library while he worked from his office, the soft sound of his voice during phone calls a comforting backdrop to my solitude. Afternoons, he would emerge and we'd share lunch, talking about books or current events or anything that kept us safely away from the deeper truths we were both dancing around. Evenings were becoming my favorite time. After dinner, we'd settle in the living room, me curled into one corner of the massive leather sofa with whatever novel had caught my attention, Luca in his chair working on his laptop or reviewing documents that looked far more complex than restaurant business should require. It was comfortable in a way I'd never experienced before. Damien had always needed constant attention, constant conversation, constant reassurance that I was focused entirely on him. But Luca seemed content with my presence without requiring performance, and the peaceful silence between us felt more intimate than any conversation I'd ever had. Tonight, though, the quiet felt different, charged with questions that had been building for days. waited with the growing awareness that whatever was happening between us was moving beyond simple protection into territory that both thrilled and terrified me. I closed my book and studied him across the space between us. He was reading something that had drawn deep lines of concentration across his forehead, his green-gray eyes moving rapidly across the pages. There was something almost predatory about his focus, an intensity that reminded me he was far more than the sophisticated gentleman who cooked me breakfast and discussed literature over dinner. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my voice softer than intended in the quiet room. He looked up immediately, giving me his complete attention in that way that always made my pulse quicken. "Of course. What exactly do you do? I mean, beyond the restaurant. The calls, the meetings, all of this." I gestured around the penthouse. "I know it's more than just running Benedetto's." For a long moment, he simply looked at me, and I could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth I could handle. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful but direct. "My family has been in this city for 3 generations," he said. "We started with a single restaurant, but over the years we've expanded into other areas. Construction, import-export, private security. Some of our business requires discretion, operates in spaces where the law is more fluid." He paused, watching my face carefully. "We protect our territory, our people, our interests. Sometimes that protection requires methods that wouldn't appear in any business textbook." I felt my heart rate quicken as the implications sank in. "You're talking about organized crime?" I said quietly. "The Mafia?" Luca's jaw tightened slightly. "Family organization is the term I prefer. But yes, if you need to put a label on it, that's accurate." I should have been terrified, should have been gathering my things and planning my escape from yet another dangerous man. But instead, all I felt was a strange sense of relief. The pieces finally fit: his quiet authority, the way people deferred to him, the security measures, the resources that seemed unlimited. "Does that frighten you?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It should," I admitted. "But honestly, I've never felt safer in my life than I have these past few days. Whatever you are, whoever you are, you've shown me more kindness and protection than I've known in years." Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "You want to know why I help people like you? Why I can't walk away when I see someone being hurt?" I nodded, sensing this was important, that he was about to share something few people ever heard. "I was 12 when my father brought me to a meeting," he said, leaning back in his chair but maintaining eye contact. "There was a man there who owed money to the family, and his wife was with him. She had bruises on her arms, around her throat. Fresh ones." Luca's voice remained steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "My father conducted his business, got what was owed, and we left. But I kept thinking about that woman, about the fear in her eyes. Not fear of us, but of him, of what would happen when they got home." He ran his fingers through his dark hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as one he made when wrestling with difficult emotions. 3 days later, I heard she'd killed herself. Couldn't take any more of what he was doing to her. And I realized that all the power my father possessed, all the respect and fear he commanded, couldn't protect the people who needed it most if we only used it for business. The story hit me like a physical blow, both because of the tragedy he was describing and because of what it revealed about him. He'd spent his life using his power to protect the vulnerable, and I was just the latest in a long line of women he'd helped. "That's why you stepped in with Damien," I said. "Because you've seen what men like him do." "Men like him are cowards," Lucas said, and for the first time there was real heat in his voice. "They prey on people they think can't fight back, people who have no one to protect them. The only thing they understand is superior force." The certainty in his tone sent a shiver through me, not of fear, but of recognition. This was what safety looked like. Not the false protection Damien had offered, which came with strings and conditions and the constant threat of withdrawal, but real security backed by absolute capability. "What about you?" Luca asked gently. "You've told me bits and pieces, but I sense there's more. What really happened with him?" The question opened something inside me that I'd kept carefully locked away. Maybe it was the wine we'd shared with dinner, or the intimacy of the quiet room, or the knowledge that this man had just trusted me with his deepest truths. Whatever it was, I found myself telling him everything. I told him about meeting Damien at a charity fundraiser where I was working as a volunteer coordinator, how charming and successful he'd seemed, how he'd swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and weekend trips to places I'd only dreamed of visiting. How flattered I'd been that someone so sophisticated and wealthy would be interested in a girl from a middle-class family who was putting herself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. I told him about the gradual isolation, how Damien had slowly convinced me that my friends were jealous of our relationship, that my family didn't understand what we had together, how he'd moved me into his apartment after 6 months, claiming he wanted to take care of me, that I shouldn't have to worry about working or paying bills. How the control had started small, commenting on my clothes, suggesting I was too trusting of other people, gradually taking over every aspect of my life until I couldn't make a single decision without his approval. The first time he hit me was 8 months in, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'd gone to lunch with my sister without telling him, and when I got home he was furious. Said I was being disrespectful, that a woman in my position should know better than to go behind her man's back. Luca's knuckles were white where they gripped his glass, but he didn't interrupt, didn't try to comfort me or change the subject. He just listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I told him about the escalation, how the physical abuse had gotten worse while Damien became more skilled at hiding it, how he'd isolated me so completely that I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no resources of my own, how he'd convinced me that I deserved what was happening, that my mistakes and failures were what drove him to lose control. How it had taken me almost 2 years to understand that none of it was my fault, that no matter what I did or didn't do, he would always find a reason to hurt me. What finally made you leave? Luca asked when I paused. He started talking about marriage, I said, about making it official, about how much easier it would be to keep me in line once I was legally his wife. And I realized that if I didn't leave then, I never would. That he would kill me eventually, whether he meant to or not. By the time I finished, there were tears streaming down my face, but they felt different from the tears I'd shed over the past few months. These weren't tears of shame or fear, but of release, of finally being able to share the full truth with someone who understood exactly what it meant. Luca set down his glass and moved to the sofa beside me, his presence warm and solid and comforting. When he reached out to cup my face gently, brushing away the tears with his thumbs, I felt something shift between us that went far beyond protector and protected. He will never hurt you again, Lucas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute promise. I swear to you, Celeste, he will never lay another hand on you. I believe you, I whispered, and I did. Completely, and without reservation. The moment stretched between us, loaded with everything we'd shared and everything we hadn't said yet. I could see the war playing out in his green-gray eyes. The desire to kiss me battling against his need to be sure I was ready, that I wasn't just responding to gratitude or trauma or the false safety of dependence. Kiss me, I said quietly, making the choice for both of us. He studied my face for another heartbeat, searching for any sign of uncertainty or fear. When he found none, he leaned forward slowly, giving me every opportunity to change my mind, until his lips brushed against mine with infinite tenderness. The kiss was everything my first kiss should have been and nothing like the demanding possession I'd learned to expect. Luca kissed me like I was precious, like I was a gift he couldn't quite believe he'd been given. His hands stayed gentle on my face, his mouth soft and questioning against mine, letting me set the pace and depth. When I pressed closer, when my hands fisted in his shirt and I kissed him back with growing urgency, he responded with careful passion that made me feel powerful and cherished all at once. We broke apart when his phone rang, the sound jarring in the intimate quiet. Luca closed his eyes briefly, his forehead resting against mine. I need to answer this, he said reluctantly. It's my business line. He reached for the phone on the side table, and I saw his expression change the moment he looked at the display. The warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by something cold and dangerous. Luca Benedetto, he answered, his voice perfectly controlled. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I could see its effect on Luca. His entire body went rigid, his jaw clenching as he listened to whatever was being said. I see, he said finally, his tone glacial. And you think threatening me is wise? A pause. Then, you have no idea what you're dealing with, Mr. Fletcher. But you're about to learn. My blood turned to ice. Damien was on the phone. Damien had somehow gotten Luca's private number and was calling to make threats. Here's what's going to happen, Luca continued, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made even me shiver. You're going to stop looking for her. You're going to stop asking questions about me. You're going to disappear from both our lives permanently. And if I hear that you've even spoken her name to another person, you'll discover exactly why people in this city know better than to cross my family. He hung up without waiting for a response, but I could see the controlled fury radiating from every line of his body. This was the other side of Luca Benedetto, the dangerous man whose protection came with the weight of real power behind it. What did he say? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Luca turned to look at me, and I saw him consciously soften his expression, pulling back from whatever dark place the call had taken him to. He threatened to make trouble for my business interests unless I hand you over to him. Said he has friends in law enforcement who would be very interested in my family's activities. Fear shot through me. He could really hurt you, couldn't he? Your business, your family? Luca smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. He could try, he said with quiet confidence. But Damien Fletcher is about to learn the difference between having money and having real power. As I looked into his green-gray eyes, seeing the steel beneath the gentleness, I finally understood the full scope of what he was offering me. Not just protection, but the security that came from belonging to someone who commanded genuine respect and fear. Someone who would use every resource at his disposal to keep me safe. Come here, he said softly, holding out his arm. I curled against his side, my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. His arm tightened around me, and I felt the tension gradually leave his body as we settled into comfortable quiet. I must have dozed off there, because the next thing I knew, Luca was gently shaking my shoulder. Let's get you to bed, he said, helping me to my feet. But as he walked me to the guest room, I realized something had fundamentally changed. I wasn't just a woman he was protecting anymore. I was someone he cared about, someone whose safety and happiness had become personally important to him. And despite everything I'd been through, despite all the reasons I should be terrified of trusting another man, I was falling completely, irrevocably in love with Luca Benedetto. The call came at 8:30 on a Thursday evening, just as the dinner rush at Benedetto's was reaching its peak. Luca had been in meetings all afternoon with what he described as family business associates, leaving me curled up in his library with a novel I couldn't concentrate on. My mind kept drifting to the kiss we'd shared 2 nights ago, to the way his hands had felt so gentle against my face, to the promise in his eyes that had made me believe in possibilities I'd thought were lost forever. When his phone buzzed with an urgent message, I saw his expression change immediately. There was a problem at one of the construction sites, something that required his immediate attention. He'd kissed my forehead before leaving, a gesture so tender and protective that I'd felt it long after the elevator doors closed behind him. Now I was alone in the penthouse, trying to read while fighting the growing anxiety that always crept in when Luca wasn't nearby. 3 weeks of safety had made me soft, had allowed me to forget that Damien was still out there, still looking for ways to hurt me. The second call came 20 minutes later, and this time it was for me. Miss Romano, the voice said when I answered Luca's home line. This is Marcus from Benedetto's. I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been an incident at the restaurant. Someone claiming to be your boyfriend is here demanding to see you. He's causing quite a scene. My blood turned to ice. Damien had found another way to get to me, had chosen the one night when Luca was unreachable to make his move. Where's Luca? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He's handling an emergency across town. Marcos is here, though. He says to tell you that you shouldn't worry, that everything is under control. Marcos was Luca's lieutenant, a man I'd met briefly who carried himself with the same quiet authority as his boss. If Luca trusted him to handle this situation, then I should feel safe. But all I could think about was Damien's voice on the phone 2 nights ago, the threats he'd made, the promise that this wasn't over. Tell Marcos I'm coming, I said before Marcus could protest. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The ride to the restaurant felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every instinct told me to stay hidden in the penthouse, to let Luca's people handle Damien while I remained safe behind locked doors and security systems. But I couldn't shake the feeling that running again would only make things worse, that Damien would keep escalating until someone got hurt. By the time I arrived at Benedetto's, I could see the situation was already spiraling beyond control. Police cars lined the street outside, their flashing lights casting strange shadows against the restaurant's elegant facade. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by whatever drama was unfolding inside. Marcus met me at the door, his usually composed expression tight with concern. "Miss Romano, I don't think you should be here. Marcos has the situation contained, but your presence might escalate things." Too late. Through the restaurant's windows, I could see Damien pacing near the bar, his movements agitated and desperate. Even from a distance, I could read the dangerous energy radiating from him, the barely controlled fury that I knew could explode at any moment. He saw me the instant I walked through the door. "Celeste," he called out, his voice carrying across the restaurant with unmistakable possession. "There you are, baby. I've been so worried about you." The endearment hit me like a physical blow, bringing back memories of all the times he'd used that same tone to manipulate me back into compliance. But I wasn't the same terrified woman who had fled from him 3 months ago. I'd found my strength in the safety Luca had provided, had remembered who I was beneath all the fear and doubt Damien had planted in my mind. "I'm not your baby," I said clearly, loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear. "I'm not your girlfriend, and I'm not going anywhere with you." Damien's face darkened, and I saw several of the remaining diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. The police officers who'd been called to manage the disturbance moved closer, but I could see they weren't sure what to do. Damien hadn't technically broken any laws yet, hadn't made any overt threats they could act on. "Now, sweetheart," Damien said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to dread. "I know you're confused, probably scared by whatever these people have told you about me. But I'm here now, and I'm going to take you home where you belong." He took a step toward me, and suddenly Marcos was there, a solid wall of muscle and quiet menace positioned between us. The man was easily 6'4" and built like someone who knew how to handle himself in any situation. "That's close enough," Marcos said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even the police officers pay attention. "The lady has made her position clear." Damien's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold fury I knew lurked beneath his charming facade. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he snarled at Marcos. "I know exactly what kind of business this place really runs, what kind of man your boss really is. One phone call to the right people, and this whole operation gets shut down permanently." The threat hung in the air like poison, and I felt something inside me snap. For months, I'd lived in fear of this man, had allowed his threats and manipulation to control every aspect of my life. But watching him try to hurt the people who'd protected me, threatening to destroy Luca's business because he couldn't accept that I'd chosen freedom over his twisted version of love, I felt a rage I didn't know I possessed. "Stop," I said, stepping around Marcos despite his protective gesture. "Just stop, Damien. This isn't about them, and you know it. This is about you not being able to accept that I left you." Damien's pale eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I saw something almost vulnerable flicker across his features. "You don't understand what you're doing, Celeste. These people, this world you think you want to be part of, it's dangerous. You need me to protect you from it." The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. He was warning me about danger while threatening the one man who'd ever made me feel truly safe. "I know exactly what world I'm choosing," I said quietly. "And I know exactly what I'm walking away from. I'm not afraid anymore, Damien. Not of you, not of your threats, not of anything you think you can do to me." Something shifted in his expression then, the last pretense of concern disappearing to reveal the cold calculation underneath. "If you won't come willingly," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I remembered too well, "then maybe your new friends need to understand the consequences of keeping what's mine." He reached into his jacket, and everything seemed to happen at once. Marcos moved faster than I would have thought possible for such a large man, his hand clamping down on Damien's wrist before whatever he was reaching for could emerge. The police officers surged forward, suddenly very interested in the proceedings. And then Luca was there. I hadn't seen him arrive, hadn't heard the door open, but suddenly he was standing just inside the restaurant's entrance, and the entire atmosphere in the room changed. The quiet conversations stopped completely. The police officers paused in their movement toward Damien. Even Marcos, who'd been handling the situation with professional competence, seemed to relax slightly now that his boss had arrived. Luca's green-gray eyes found mine first, a quick assessment that confirmed I was unharmed before moving to Damien with the kind of focused attention a predator gives its prey. When he spoke, his voice was so calm it was almost conversational. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, moving across the restaurant with unhurried confidence. "I thought we'd reached an understanding during our last conversation." Damien released whatever he'd been reaching for and straightened, trying to regain some of the authority he'd lost when Marcos had intervened. "I'm here for my girlfriend," he said, though some of the bluster had gone out of his voice. "I have every legal right to speak with her." "She's not your girlfriend," Luca replied with the same conversational tone. "She's my employee, my guest, and under my protection. And you've just threatened her, my business, and my family in front of multiple witnesses." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I watched Damien's face as the full implications of his situation began to sink in. He wasn't dealing with some rival boyfriend he could intimidate or manipulate. He was facing a man whose power and resources were far beyond anything he'd encountered before. "I think it's time we had a private conversation," Luca continued, gesturing toward the restaurant's back office. "Gentlemen," he addressed the police officers with the kind of respect that suggested he knew several of them personally. "I apologize for the disturbance. This is a personal matter that we can resolve without further incident." One of the officers nodded, clearly relieved to avoid whatever complications might arise from pursuing the situation further. "We'll clear the scene, Mr. Benedetto. But if there are any more disturbances tonight—" "There won't be," Luca assured him with quiet certainty. 20 minutes later, Damien walked out of the restaurant and disappeared into the night. I never learned exactly what Luca had said to him during their private conversation, but I saw Damien's face as he left, pale, shaken, the arrogant confidence completely stripped away. The ride back to the penthouse was silent, but I could feel the tension radiating from Luca like heat. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his expression controlled, but I could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. The careful way he was breathing that suggested he was fighting to maintain his composure. It wasn't until we were back in the safety of his apartment, the door locked and secured behind us, that he finally spoke. "You could have been hurt," he said quietly, turning to face me in the marble foyer. "If I hadn't gotten there when I did." "But you did," I interrupted, stepping closer to him. "You came for me. You protected me." Again, I saw something flicker in his green-gray eyes, some emotion too complex to name. "When I gotten the call that you were at the restaurant, that he was there, I've never been so afraid in my life, Celeste. The thought of losing you, of him hurting you while I wasn't there to stop it." "Kiss me," I said, exactly as I had 2 nights before. But this time there was no hesitation, no careful consideration of timing or appropriateness. This time we both moved at the same moment, coming together with a desperate hunger that had been building between us for days. The kiss was nothing like the tender exploration we'd shared before. This was need and relief and the overwhelming certainty that we'd found something worth fighting for. Luca's hands tangled in my hair while mine fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, trying to eliminate every inch of space between us. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard, both shaking with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with want. "Celeste," he said, his voice rough with the effort of control. "If we do this, if we cross this line, I know," I whispered against his lips. "I know exactly what I'm choosing." The next hour was a revelation of tenderness and passion that redefined everything I thought I knew about intimacy. Luca loved me like I was precious, like every touch was a gift he couldn't quite believe he'd been given. He took his time learning every inch of my skin, whispering words in Italian that I didn't understand but felt in my bones. When he asked permission for every new touch, every progression, I felt the last walls around my heart crumble completely. This was what love was supposed to feel like, safe and wild and right all at the same time. Afterward, lying in his arms in the master bedroom I'd never entered before, I traced patterns on his chest and listened to his heartbeat gradually slow to normal. "I love you," I thought, but the words stayed trapped in my throat. Too much, too soon, too complicated by everything that had brought us together. But when Luca pressed his lips to the top of my head and whispered something in Italian that sounded like a prayer, I knew he felt it too. This dangerous, impossible, absolutely perfect love that had grown in the shadow of threats and fear. Tomorrow we'd have to figure out how to build a life together despite the complications of his world and the lingering danger of mine. Tonight, though, we had this, the absolute certainty that whatever came next, we'd face it together. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be completely, irrevocably safe in someone else's love. And it was worth every risk we'd taken to find it. The morning after our confrontation with Damien, I woke in Luca's arms to the sound of his phone ringing insistently. He answered with the careful alertness of a man accustomed to early morning crises, but I could feel the tension that immediately flooded his body as he listened to whatever was being reported. "We have a problem," he said after hanging up, his arm tightening around me protectively. "Damien filed a police report last night claiming I kidnapped you. He's also contacted the FBI, suggesting they investigate my family's business activities." Fear shot through me, cold and sharp. "Can he do that? Can he really cause legal trouble for you?" Luca pressed his lips to my temple, a gesture that had become second nature over the past few weeks. "He can try, but making accusations and proving them are different things. Still, this complicates matters." Over the next 3 days, I watched Luca handle the crisis with the kind of calm competence that reminded me exactly why he commanded so much respect. While I paced the penthouse worrying about lawyers and investigations, he made phone calls to people whose names I recognized from newspaper headlines: city councilmen, judges, businessmen whose influence stretched across multiple industries. The beauty of legitimate business interests, he explained one evening as we shared dinner, is that they provide excellent cover for scrutiny. Every tax return filed properly, every permit obtained through correct channels, every employee documented and insured. When investigators come looking for criminal activity, they find a successful restaurant and construction company owned by a man whose family has been contributing to this city's economy for 3 generations. Still, I could see the stress wearing on him. Not fear. Luca didn't seem capable of the kind of fear that paralyzed, only the sharp alertness of someone managing multiple threats simultaneously. But I hated that Damien had found a way to hurt him through me, hated that my past was creating problems for the man who'd given me everything. Then Damien made his final, fatal mistake. I was alone in the penthouse on Friday afternoon when the call came. Not to Luca's phone this time, but to the main number at Benedetto's. Somehow he'd convinced Marcus that it was an emergency, that he needed to speak with me immediately about dropping the charges. When I answered, his voice was different, desperate, unhinged in a way that made my blood run cold. "You think you're so smart, hiding behind your Mafia boyfriend," he said without preamble. "But I know where your sister works, Celeste. I know exactly how to get your attention." My heart stopped. Lily worked at a small law firm downtown, a recent graduate who'd finally landed her dream job after years of struggling through school. The thought of Damien anywhere near her made me feel sick. "If you hurt her," I started, but he cut me off with a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "I'm not going to hurt her," he said. "You are. Because you're going to come to me willingly? Or I'm going to tell her employer exactly what kind of family you're involved with now. How long do you think she'll keep her job when they find out her sister is the girlfriend of a known criminal?" The manipulation was so perfect, so precisely targeted at my greatest weakness, that for a moment I almost believed I had no choice. Lily had worked so hard to build her career, had sacrificed so much to get where she was. I couldn't let my choices destroy her future. But then I remembered something Luca had said during one of our late-night conversations. The only power bullies have is what we give them. The moment we stop being afraid, they become exactly what they really are: pathetic, powerless, and desperate. "No," I said quietly into the phone. "What?" Damien sounded genuinely shocked, as if the possibility of my refusal had never occurred to him. I said, "No, Damien. I'm not coming to you. I'm not leaving the man I love because you threatened my sister. You want to tell her employer about Luca? Go ahead. Lily's stronger than you think, and she loves me enough to understand that I've finally found someone who makes me happy." The silence that followed was so long I thought he might have hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was cold with the kind of rage I remembered from our worst fights. "Fine. If you won't come willingly, I'll just have to take you." The line went dead, and I immediately called Luca. He arrived home within 20 minutes, bringing with him 2 men I'd never seen before who positioned themselves discreetly around the penthouse. Marcos appeared shortly after, along with what looked like enough security to protect a small country. He's going to try something desperate, Luca said as we sat in his office surrounded by the quiet efficiency of his people preparing for whatever Damien might attempt. Desperate men make mistakes, and when he makes his, we'll end this permanently. I wanted to ask what permanently meant, but part of me already knew. Men like Damien, who built their sense of self on controlling and hurting others, didn't respond to warnings or legal consequences. They only understood superior force, and Luca was prepared to provide exactly that. The attack came that evening, just as we were finishing dinner. The building's security system alerted us to unauthorized access in the parking garage, followed immediately by reports of multiple individuals attempting to breach the service elevators. Damien had brought help, 3 men who looked like the kind of private security money could buy, armed and apparently willing to commit serious crimes for the right price. They never made it past the lobby. I watched from the penthouse security monitors as Luca's people intercepted the intrusion with a kind of professional efficiency that spoke of extensive training and experience. Within 10 minutes, it was over. Damien and his hired muscle were in police custody, facing charges that would ensure lengthy prison sentences. But more importantly, investigators searching Damien's apartment in connection with the break-in attempt discovered evidence of other crimes: financial fraud, blackmail, even violence against previous girlfriends who'd tried to leave him. The man who terrorized me for 2 years was facing consequences that had nothing to do with Luca's influence and everything to do with his own choices finally catching up with him. "It's over," Luca said when the police called to confirm Damien would be held without bail, pending trial on multiple felony charges. "He's never going to hurt you again, Celeste. Never." That night, lying in Luca's arms after the most terrifying and liberating day of my life, I finally found the courage to say the words that had been locked in my heart for weeks. "I love you," I whispered against his chest. "I love you so much it scares me." His arms tightened around me, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Ti amo anch'io," he said, pressing his lips to my hair. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." We held each other in the darkness, both understanding that we'd crossed a line there was no returning from. This wasn't just gratitude or attraction or the intensity of shared danger. This was the kind of love that changed everything, that made 2 separate lives into one shared future. 3 weeks later, Luca proposed. He did it on a quiet Sunday morning in his kitchen, while I was sitting at the counter watching him make breakfast with the same focused attention he brought to everything. There was no grand gesture, no orchestrated romance, just him setting down his coffee cup and reaching into his pocket for a small velvet box. "Marry me," he said simply, opening the box to reveal a ring that took my breath away. Not because of its size or cost, though it was clearly both substantial and expensive, but because of what it represented. Safety, partnership, a future I'd never dared to imagine. "Yes," I said, not needing to think about it for even a moment. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for my hand. Later, I'd learned that it had. That Luca had commissioned it weeks earlier, had been carrying it with him waiting for the right moment to offer me forever. We were married 2 months later in a small ceremony at Benedetto's, surrounded by his family and the few friends I'd reconnected with since finding safety in Luca's world. My sister Lily served as my maid of honor, tearful and radiant as she watched me exchange vows with the man who'd saved my life in every way a person could be saved. But before I share the happiness that followed, I have to ask you something. When you're looking for love, for that person who will protect and cherish you, how do you know when someone is offering genuine care versus control disguised as protection? Have you ever had to choose between safety and independence, only to discover that real love offers both? Where are you in your own journey toward finding someone who makes you feel powerful and precious at the same time? Because that's what Luca gave me. Not just protection from the man who'd hurt me, but the security to become the strongest version of myself. 6 months after our wedding, I stood in the same spot where I'd first frozen in terror at the sight of Damien Fletcher. But everything about the moment was different now. Where once I'd been a frightened waitress dropping wine glasses and hiding from my past, I was now Celeste Benedetto, co-owner and manager of the most successful restaurant in the city. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the months following our marriage, Luca had encouraged me to pursue the business education I'd abandoned during my relationship with Damien. I'd thrown myself into learning everything about restaurant management, about the legitimate businesses that formed the foundation of the Benedetto family empire. Turns out I had a gift for it. Within 6 months, I'd streamlined operations that had been running inefficiently for years, implemented new systems for inventory and staff management, and increased profits by 30%. Luca liked to joke that marrying me was the best business decision he'd ever made, but I knew he was only half kidding. Tonight was special, though. We were hosting a celebration dinner for the restaurant's 5th anniversary under Luca's ownership, and every table was occupied by the kind of distinguished guests who commanded respect throughout the city. City officials, successful businessmen, even a few celebrities who discovered that Benedetto's offered the kind of discreet elegance and exceptional food that made it worth the wait for reservations. I moved through the dining room with the confident grace of someone completely at home in her environment, checking on tables, ensuring every detail met the exacting standards that had made us famous. The silk dress I wore, midnight blue, Luca's favorite color on me, was a far cry from the simple uniform I'd worn as a server. Everything about me radiated the quiet authority of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. Luca caught my eye from across the room where he was speaking with the mayor and his wife, and the smile he gave me was full of the private heat that still made my pulse quicken after almost a year of marriage. Even surrounded by important guests, conducting the kind of business that required his full attention, part of him was always focused on me. "How's our little one tonight?" he asked when I joined him a few minutes later, his hand moving to rest gently on the slight curve of my belly that was just beginning to show. "Active," I said, covering his hand with mine. "I think he or she is excited about the party." The pregnancy had been a surprise, discovered just a month earlier during a routine doctor's visit. We hadn't been trying, but we hadn't been preventing it either, both of us content to let our future unfold naturally. When Dr. Martinez had delivered the news, Luca had gone completely still for a moment before sweeping me into his arms with a joy so pure it had brought tears to my eyes. A baby. Our baby. The final piece of the family we'd built together. "Mrs. Benedetto," the mayor's wife said warmly, "you look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy suits you beautifully." "Thank you," I replied, accepting her congratulations with the easy confidence that had replaced the terror I'd once felt around powerful people. "We're very excited." "And how is the restaurant expansion coming along?" the mayor asked Luca. "I heard you're planning to open a second location uptown." "The negotiations are going well," Luca confirmed. "We hope to break ground early next year, once we've settled into our new family routine." Our new family routine. The phrase filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the excellent wine we'd been serving all evening. This was what happiness looked like, not the desperate relief of escaping danger, but the deep contentment of building something beautiful and lasting with someone who cherished you. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed with promises to return soon, Luca and I stood together in the quiet restaurant reviewing the night's success. The staff had long since finished cleaning and gone home, leaving us alone in the space that had brought us together. "Do you ever miss it?" Luca asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind as we looked out at the empty dining room. "The simplicity of your old life, before you got involved with a complicated man like me?" I leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid strength of him, breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with the lingering aromas of basil and garlic that always clung to the restaurant. "Never," I said without hesitation. "Not for a single moment. Even with all the complications, the business pressures, the family politics, the fact that some people will always whisper about what the Benedetto name really means." I turned in his arms to face him, seeing my own happiness reflected in his green-gray eyes. "Especially because of the complications," I said. "There are complications now. Our business, our family, our future to build together." He kissed me then, slow and deep and full of promise. When we broke apart, his forehead rested against mine in the gesture that had become uniquely ours. "Ti amo, Mrs. Benedetto," he whispered. "Ti amo anch'io," I replied, the Italian words feeling as natural on my tongue as they had the first time he'd taught them to me. Outside, the city continued its restless energy, full of people searching for safety, for love, for the kind of protection that came without strings or conditions. Some of them would find it, as I had. Others would settle for less, accepting control disguised as care, manipulation packaged as devotion. But for those lucky enough to find the real thing, the kind of love that made you stronger rather than smaller, safer rather than more afraid, the world became a place full of possibilities instead of threats. As Luca helped me into my coat, and we prepared to go home to the penthouse that had become our sanctuary, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the restaurant's window. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the terrified girl who'd once hidden behind these same windows, dropping wine glasses and jumping at shadows. This woman was confident, protected, cherished. She was building a business, growing a family, creating a life full of the kind of love songs were written about. She was everything I'd never dared to dream I could become, everything that became possible when someone finally showed me what it meant to be truly, completely safe. Luca's hand found mine as we walked to the car, his fingers intertwining with mine in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make about the restaurant, the baby, the future we were building together. But tonight, walking through the city streets with the man who'd saved me in every way a person could be saved, I felt nothing but gratitude for the moment when my past had walked through that door and shattered my fragile peace. Because sometimes the most terrifying collision between what was and what could be turns out to be exactly the push we need to find our way home. And I was finally, truly, eternally home.